It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I returned home from college. I'd been away for a few months, and for the first time in a while, I was eager to escape the noise and chaos of dorm life. My room, a small but cozy space at the back of the house, had always been my sanctuary. It had my things, my books, my favorite chair, posters of bands I'd followed for years, the faint smell of lavender from the candles I always kept burning. When I left for school, everything was where I left it, or at least that's how I imagined it. But when I walked through the door, the house didn't feel the same. There was an unfamiliar hum in the air, the kind of quiet that only comes when someone's been trying to rearrange things while you're gone. My dad's voice echoed from the kitchen, but it wasn't a greeting. He was too preoccupied with something or someone else. "Your room's been repurposed," he said casually, appearing from around the corner of the hallway as I dropped my bags onto the living room floor. "What do you mean, repurposed?" I asked, my voice already tight with confusion. My eyes swept over the space. The furniture was gone. The desk I'd spent hours on was now shoved against the far wall, and in its place, a single bed, a small dresser, a pile of half-empty boxes stacked up in the corner. I blinked. My first thought was that maybe I had just misremembered the layout, but no. This wasn't my room, not anymore. Before I could process what was happening, my dad gave me that half-smile of his, the one that was supposed to ease the tension, but only made it worse. "We had to make space for him, sweetheart." He gestured vaguely to the empty air, and I knew exactly who he meant. "He's settled in now, so you'll need to find somewhere else to stay." "Somewhere else?" I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, somewhere else? That's my room." "Technically, we had to give him a place to stay," he said, scratching the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. "He's your stepbrother, after all, and we needed to make room for him." I stood there frozen, unable to move, let alone speak. It wasn't just the room that was gone. It was the very sense of home I'd carried with me through all those lonely nights at college. I thought, maybe naively, that I'd returned to some semblance of normal. Instead, I was standing in a house that didn't feel like mine anymore. "You'll still pay the bills, though, right?" he added, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We rely on your help with that, remember?" I blinked again. This wasn't a question, it was a statement. The way he said it made it feel like it was my responsibility to cover everything, like I owed him this. I was taken aback by how easily he had decided to replace me, my space, my belongings, everything, without so much as a second thought. "Wait, are you serious?" My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like ice. "You want me to keep paying for your bills while you throw me out of my own room? Just like that?" Dad shrugged, unfazed. "It's not like we're kicking you out, sweetie. We're just asking for you to adjust." I couldn't even respond. I wanted to scream at him, but it was like all the words got stuck in my throat. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a wave, and I was too shocked to do anything but nod, as if that could somehow make this all make sense. I'd always been the good daughter, the one who put in the extra effort to keep the peace, to keep things running smoothly. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay in this space anymore, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when I was being slowly erased from this house. So I did what I had to do. I walked up to my old room, ignored the fact that it wasn't mine anymore, and began packing. Slowly at first, then faster, my hands shaking with a mix of frustration and a strange sense of relief. The more I packed, the more I realized how much I had outgrown this place, outgrown this family. I wasn't going to be the doormat anymore. I knew I had to leave, and I wasn't going to leave quietly. The room wasn't mine, but I was still going to take something from them. I wasn't going to let this go without making them feel it. I was going to pull the plug. The moment I stepped out of my room, bags in hand, my eyes landed on him. Jack, my new stepbrother, sprawled out on the couch like he owned the place. I don't know what I expected, but it sure wasn't him, looking up at me with that smug little grin plastered across his face. He was just a kid, barely 18, but the way he looked at me said it all. He knew exactly how much my father had already chosen him over me. "Hey," he said, not bothering to get up. "Room's nice. Thanks for letting me borrow it." My stomach turned. I clenched my jaw so tight I thought it might crack. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to look at him. But I couldn't ignore the fact that this whole thing, this mess, was happening because of him. "Don't thank me," I managed to say. "This was never my choice." Dad had retreated into the kitchen, probably making a sandwich or something equally mindless. His distraction only served to further highlight how little he cared about what was going on. He was probably too busy enjoying his new life to notice how it was unraveling my old one. "You should have heard Dad when he was talking about you," Jack continued, his voice dripping with that irritating mix of entitlement and cluelessness. "He said you'd be totally cool with it. He's a big fan of your adjustability." I felt my pulse pick up. The words hit me like daggers, but there was nothing I could do. I just had to stand there, frozen in that moment of awkward tension, and fight the urge to lash out at him. "You're joking, right?" I asked, forcing a laugh, though it came out hollow and bitter. "Adjust? Just like that?" Jack shrugged, his expression the picture of casual indifference. He had no idea. Or maybe he did, but it didn't matter to him. All that mattered was that he was in, my dad's new favorite, his new son. And I? Well, I was just the girl who'd been displaced for this kid, who wasn't even related to me by blood. I turned my back on him, refusing to let my anger show, but the rage simmered underneath, an uncontrollable storm. I walked past him, through the hallway, to the kitchen, where my dad had just finished making his lunch. He hadn't even noticed I'd come in. "Dad," I said, my voice sharp now, pushing through the shock and disbelief that had been keeping me quiet. "What the hell is going on?" He didn't look up from his sandwich. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean? What do I mean?" I snapped. "You gave my room to Jack. He's in my space, my room that I've had since I was a kid, and you're just okay with it? You didn't even tell me about it." Dad finally looked up, as if I had just interrupted his lunch, his precious, peaceful lunch. "Well, I didn't think it would be a big deal," he said with that dismissive tone that made my blood boil. "Jack needed somewhere to stay, and your room was the only one that made sense." "Made sense?" I felt the sharp edge of my voice cut through the air. "I'm still here, Dad. I live here. I came back home expecting the one place that was mine. But I guess you don't think I need that anymore." Dad's eyes flicked back down to his sandwich, like I was the one being unreasonable. "I told you, we had to make space for him. It's just temporary." "Temporary?" My voice cracked, and I hated that it did. "How long is temporary, Dad? Because you're acting like I don't matter anymore. Like I don't belong here." He took a slow bite, chewing deliberately, as if this were a casual conversation. "It's just how it is. You're in college now. You're not really living here full time. And besides, you're helping with the bills, right? You'll still be contributing, I hope." I felt a cold, sinking sensation in my stomach. My dad had just casually confirmed it. I was nothing more than an ATM to him, a paycheck. I wasn't even his daughter anymore. I was a resource, a backup plan. I wasn't even sure who I was to him at this point. I thought I knew him, but now I saw the truth. "Right," I said, my voice dropping lower. "I'll still pay. Don't worry about that. But maybe I'll stop paying you for a while. See how you handle it when you're the one struggling." Dad finally looked up, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned and walked back toward my room, passing Jack on the way. I didn't look at him. He didn't deserve my attention. But I could feel the anger building in me, the anger at how my father had just handed everything over to him like I was an afterthought. When I reached my room, I stood there for a long moment, just staring at what had once been my sanctuary, my safe space. Now it was just his. I knew what I had to do. I didn't need to keep playing this game. I didn't need to let them walk all over me. This house, this family, it wasn't mine anymore, but I could still make them feel it. I could still make them pay for taking my life, my space, my dignity. The first step was simple: stop paying. I called the bank, canceled the automatic transfers to my dad's account. Then I reached out to the utility companies, making sure all of their bills went unpaid. I knew it would take a few days for it to really hit them, but when it did, they'd know exactly who was responsible. The shock in Dad's eyes when the mortgage came due, it would be worth every second. The first few days after I canceled the payments, I kept to myself. I was working on my school projects, keeping busy, but every moment that I spent in the house felt like an unraveling thread. It wasn't just that my room had been taken, or that my dad seemed so completely unaffected by it all. It was the way my dad had already shifted his focus entirely onto his new family. And I wasn't sure if it was even the fact that I was being disregarded that hurt the most. It was the fact that I had become invisible to him. I had gone from being the child he used to dote on, the one he'd call after a bad day, the one whose opinion mattered, to a financial contributor with no emotional value. The shift had been so gradual, so subtle, that I hadn't even realized how deep the resentment had built until I walked into the living room one afternoon to find Jack lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while my dad made small talk with his wife in the kitchen. No welcome home, no how's school, just the sound of my father's voice, excited and engaged, and the quiet hum of a family I no longer felt a part of. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger rising inside me. But every time I looked at Jack, every time I saw my dad glancing over at him with that gleam in his eye, I could feel the bitterness welling up inside me again. This kid, this stranger, had taken my room, my place in the family, and now it felt like my father didn't even notice. Later that evening, the real impact of what I had done began to set in. I overheard my dad on the phone in the kitchen, his voice rising in frustration. "Come on, you know it's not just the mortgage. I have bills piling up, credit cards, utilities, everything," he snapped, his voice sharp. "What do you mean it's not your responsibility? She's supposed to help us. She's always helped us." I didn't need to hear more. The way my dad's voice trembled with panic told me everything. He had no idea how to handle the mess I'd thrown into his life. I had to admit, it gave me some satisfaction, though it was a bitter one. The part of me that had always felt invisible, overshadowed by his new family, was finally coming to life. He needed me more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't as in control of this situation as he thought, but it wasn't just about the bills. It wasn't even about the house anymore. I was starting to see it more clearly now. It was about respect. They had taken everything from me without even realizing the damage they were doing. Jack, with his easy smile and lack of self-awareness, was suddenly so entrenched in my father's life. My dad's attention was all on him, like he was the real son. And I was the one left behind. That realization hit me harder than any of the other little cuts had. Over the next few days, Dad tried to talk to me a few times, but I was cold, detached. I kept myself busy, working on school projects or making plans with old friends. I made sure to avoid him as much as possible. It wasn't hard. My dad didn't make the effort either. It was like he'd already resigned himself to the fact that our relationship had deteriorated to this point. He didn't fight for me anymore, and for the first time, I realized I didn't know if he ever had. Jack, on the other hand, was practically living in the kitchen. He spent hours there, sometimes with his mom, sometimes alone, and I'd hear snippets of their conversations. I couldn't help but overhear them, even though I tried not to. They'd laugh, tell stories, plan things I wasn't a part of, and it grated on my nerves. One night, when I passed through the kitchen, I heard Jack's voice in the background. He was talking about college life, describing it like it was some exotic adventure he was navigating with the utmost confidence. I didn't stop to listen at first, but then he mentioned me. "Oh, I don't get how she's always at school. Like, she never really seems to be here. Must be nice to just disappear for a while." I froze. I didn't turn around. I just stood there, gripping the doorframe, fighting back the urge to say something, But I didn't. I couldn't. His words weren't even worth my time. They were just another reminder of how little respect he had for me. But the thing that really set me off was the way Dad reacted. I expected him to tell Jack to mind his manners, to say something that would have hinted at any ounce of loyalty to me, his daughter. But all Dad did was laugh, shake his head, and mutter, "Yeah, she's always been a bit of a loner." That was it. In that moment, I realized something deep and painful. My dad was never going to stick up for me. He wasn't just distant, he was complicit. He had enabled this whole situation, this whole mess, without once questioning how it affected me, without once considering that his daughter was standing there, alone, watching as everything I had built, everything I had earned, was slowly being taken away from me. But there was no more room for silence, no more waiting. I wasn't just going to sit by and watch it all unfold. I had taken the first step by pulling the plug on the finances, but now I needed to make it clear to them, to him, that I wasn't going to be silenced anymore, that I wasn't going to let them walk all over me and pretend everything was fine. It started small. I began picking at the edges of their plans, the little things. When Jack went on about a new gaming system he wanted, I casually mentioned how it would be nice if they had the money to buy it, considering their bills were all overdue. When Dad brought up the idea of going on a weekend trip, I reminded him that the last mortgage payment hadn't been made, just enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. But I knew the real consequences were coming. The late fees on their credit cards, the late payments piling up, the dread when they opened their bank statements. I didn't need to do much. They'd take care of the rest. Every day that passed, the panic in my dad's voice grew louder. It was inevitable. He had lived in his little bubble, pretending everything would always be fine. Now, he was seeing what it felt like to be caught in the mess he had created. And though part of me hated that it had come to this, another part of me couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of vindication. I was finally taking back control. They might have thought they could push me aside, but now they were going to feel the weight of their decisions, and it was only just beginning. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, when the house felt unusually still. My dad had taken the day off, probably hoping to deal with whatever financial mess was coming his way, but he hadn't fully grasped how much trouble he was really in. I'd made sure of that. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the unmistakable sound of my dad's voice, rising from the living room. It was a tone I'd heard before, high-pitched, desperate, trying to stay calm, but barely holding it together. The kind of voice someone uses when they realize they're sinking, but aren't sure how deep the water is. "Wait, this can't be right," he said. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I didn't need to. I already knew. It was happening. I didn't immediately move from my seat. Part of me wanted to let him figure it out on his own, watch as the realization sank in. But another part of me couldn't resist. I had to see it. I had to feel it. The moment when my father realized that everything he had taken for granted was now slipping through his fingers. I stood up, walked to the doorway of the living room, and leaned against the frame. Dad was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Jack, sitting next to him, was staring at his phone with that same calm indifference he always had. He had no clue what was going on. To him, this was just another day in paradise. "What the hell is this?" Dad repeated, now louder, more frantic. His voice cracked with frustration. "The bank is saying the mortgage isn't paid. There's a late fee of what the hell?" I felt my lips curl into a small, satisfied smile. This was the moment, the one where my dad would either realize he had taken me for granted or spiral into a panic, clutching at whatever he thought he could hold on to. "You told me everything was fine, that the bills were being handled," Dad went on, pacing now. His face was flushed. "What do you mean there's no payment for last month? Where the hell is the money?" Jack's head snapped up from his phone, his eyes wide with confusion. "What? Is there a problem?" He sounded like he was talking about a broken TV remote, completely unaware of what was actually happening. "Yeah, Jack," I said, stepping into the room. My voice cold, controlled. There's a problem. Turns out you can't live on someone else's generosity forever. Dad's eyes flicked over to me, his expression shifting from frustration to something else, something darker. What did you do? He demanded, voice rising. Did you cancel the payments? I didn't respond right away. I just crossed my arms, letting the tension in the room build. I wanted him to stew in the mess he had made. He had made this bed, and now he had to lie in it. You've been living off my help for so long, Dad, I said, my voice a sharp, cutting whisper. You just thought I'd keep footing the bill, didn't you? Thought you could take advantage of me and I wouldn't notice. Well, now you can see the price for your little game. I watched as his face fell. I saw the anger in his eyes flash for a second, then shift to something much worse. Panic. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Wait a minute, Jack cut in, finally seeming to register the gravity of the situation. This is about the money? I shook my head. You're not even involved in this, Jack, I said. You just moved in here and everything was handed to you. But I guess you don't know what it's like to actually earn your place. Jack opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off with a glance that made him fall silent. I don't get it, Dad muttered, sinking back into the couch. Why? Why would you do this to us? Because I'm tired of being treated like the backup, like the afterthought, I said, my voice steady, but the words biting. You gave my room away without asking me. You expected me to just sit back and keep paying the bills while you put your new family first. So yeah, I stopped the payments. You didn't even consider how it would feel for me. There was a moment of silence, just the sound of Dad's heavy breathing, the weight of everything settling in. He looked older somehow, smaller in that moment, as if the man who had once been so larger than life to me was now drowning in his own choices. And I'm not done, I continued, feeling a sense of calm resolve come over me. I've made sure the utilities are next. You'll get those bills too. And when the next payment is due for your credit cards, they're going to start calling you non-stop. You're going to feel the consequences of all this. You think I'll just let you ruin everything? Dad shouted, standing up abruptly. His face was red, eyes wild. You're my daughter. You can't do this to me. You don't get it, do you? I said, stepping forward. You stopped being my father when you decided that your new family was more important. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. His face twisted in shock, then anger. I gave you everything, he yelled, hands trembling. I raised you. No, I said, shaking my head. You didn't raise me. You raised someone else, someone who fits the mold you wanted. I'm just the leftover, the inconvenience. For a moment, Dad looked like he might explode, like he wanted to lash out physically, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring at me, speechless. Jack was still on the couch, not knowing how to react, probably still trying to wrap his mind around the chaos that had unfolded in front of him. Dad, you can't fix this, I said quietly. I'm not here to save you anymore. I'm done being the safety net. You should have thought about that before you kicked me out of my own space, before you let your new family take over. I turned on my heel, walking toward the door. As I reached it, I glanced back once more. Dad's face was pale, his shoulders slumped. The weight of his own mistakes was crashing down on him. But as satisfying as it was to watch, something inside me had shifted too. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about me finally taking back control, finally choosing myself. The rest of it was just the inevitable fallout. I didn't look back again as I stepped outside. The next few days were a blur. Dad did his best to pretend nothing was wrong, but I could tell he was on edge. The mortgage payment was past due, the bills were mounting, and the calls from the credit card companies had already started. I could hear him scrambling in the next room, trying to make arrangements, trying to find a way to cover the expenses without admitting he had made a colossal mistake. I wasn't sure if it was his pride or the weight of his own negligence that was keeping him from facing reality, but I knew one thing. He was panicked. And the worst part for him was that it was all because of decisions he'd made without considering me. I wasn't about to go in there and offer help, not anymore. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The truth was, I was tired of being the one who had to clean up after him. He had made the choice to prioritize his new family over me, and now he had to live with that. I had already done my part. I had worked hard to get the education I had, to put myself in a place where I didn't have to rely on anyone but myself, and I wasn't going to sacrifice that for a man who had never really been there when I needed him most. Jack, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the fallout. As far as he was concerned, this was just a family squabble, something that would blow over eventually. He still strutted around the house as if everything was normal, probably still living in that bubble of entitlement my dad had put him in. I could barely stand to look at him. He had no idea what real struggle felt like, and now it was starting to hit home for my dad, who had always relied on my financial support. A few days after everything went down, I finally ran into Dad in the kitchen. He had that look in his eyes, the one that said he had finally realized how badly he'd messed up. It was an unfamiliar look. I hadn't seen it on him in years. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, as I reached for a glass of water. His voice was tired, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the pressure he was under. I set the glass down, not meeting his eyes. I wasn't ready to feel sorry for him. Not yet. "I know you're angry," he began, his voice trailing off. "And you have every right to be. I screwed up. I took you for granted. I thought I could handle everything, but I didn't. I thought I could just ignore how it was affecting you, and I'm sorry." I felt a knot form in my stomach. The words were nice, but they didn't feel real. It wasn't enough. It wasn't going to fix everything. "You're sorry?" I said, finally turning to face him. "Dad, you ignored me for months. You gave my room to Jack. You let him move in like I was just someone you didn't have to care about anymore. And then you just assumed I'd keep paying your bills, like I was nothing more than a cash machine. You didn't think I'd notice?" He looked down at his hands, avoiding my gaze. "I was wrong. I was selfish. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but I should have considered you. I should have seen how it affected you, how it felt. I should have asked for your help, not just taken it for granted." I shook my head, the anger flaring up again, but this time it was tinged with something else, sadness. "You didn't just take my help. You took me for granted, Dad. My time, my energy, my life. You pushed me out of my own home, and when I finally pushed back, you couldn't even understand why I was upset." His shoulders slumped even further, and I could see the regret on his face. It was too little, too late. He was finally realizing what he had done, but the damage was already done. It didn't change the fact that my trust in him had been broken, that I felt like I no longer belonged in this family. "I know it's too late to fix this," he said, his voice cracking, "but I want to try. I want to make it right." I took a deep breath, fighting the tightness in my chest. I could feel the urge to tell him everything I had been holding back, how his actions had made me feel worthless, how I had always struggled to get his attention, how he had chosen everyone else over me. But I didn't. Not yet. Not when I knew he wasn't really hearing me. Not when I knew it wouldn't matter in the long run. "You can't make it right, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "You can't just undo everything. You've broken something, and you can't fix it with an apology. It's too late for that." He nodded, his face clouded with shame. "I understand that now." I turned away from him, walking back to my room. I didn't have anything else to say. There was no magic word, no easy fix. My father had taken the one thing I needed most, his respect, and thrown it away. And while I couldn't change what he had done, I could control how I responded to it. I could take back my power, I could decide what happened next in my life, and I didn't need him to make that decision for me. Later that night, the phone rang. It was my dad. I didn't pick up. I knew what he wanted to say, but I wasn't interested in apologies anymore. What mattered now was the life I was building for myself, the one where I didn't have to rely on anyone but me. And that was enough. As the days passed, things didn't exactly improve. My dad and I didn't have the heart-to-hearts I had hoped for. There were no grand reconciliations, no fairy tale endings, but I was starting to realize that I didn't need that from him anymore. I had my own future to focus on. I didn't need his validation. The bills got paid eventually. My dad scrambled and borrowed from some friends, but the damage was done. I had made my point. And when it was all over, I was left with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. I had finally stood up for myself. I had taken control of my life, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace.